Good evening, this is Brass Tacks. I'm Zakir Jacob. When Xi Jinping decided to skip the Delhi G20 summit, it was thought of as a snub to the host country, India. But what India and some of its Western partners, some of the core members of the G20 showed over this weekend is that China, if it chooses to not be in the room where some of the most powerful men and women are meeting and deciding and trying to solve some of the world's gravest problems, then that is China's loss. Now, for example, the economic corridor that was announced between India, the Middle East, going all the way to France, Germany, and Italy, this is the single biggest and most direct challenge in investment and infrastructure terms in scale to the Belt and Road Initiative that was launched 10 years ago. It's a pet theme of Xi Jinping as China's president. This is a direct challenge to the BRI. The language of the joint statement, which some people in the West are saying was diluted. Ukraine has said this on record, that the G20 joint statement, particularly the parts that deal with the Russia-Ukraine war, is nothing to be proud of. But it is that joint statement which made it possible to declare the Delhi G20 summit as a success, because without that joint declaration, it would have been deemed a failure. And perhaps the West, and America in particular, decided to walk that talk, decided to go ahead and dilute some of that language on the Ukraine war because it needed India to be successfully hosting this G20, for the Delhi G20 to be a success, for India to have a big win. Therefore, it could take on China. Also, it's now becoming increasingly clear that Xi Jinping and China are only going to put their might and money and time and resources in those multilateral fora where they are the fulcrum, where China is leading, BRICS and SCO, the Asian Infrastructure Bank that they have proposed and promoted. What may that mean for multilateral institutions, right from the United Nations downwards to organizations like the WTO and the World Bank, and of course, to forums like the G20? Is China getting more insular? And is the West and India, and that's what was amply evident in the last couple of days of the G20 here in Delhi, are they successful in isolating China?
G20 समिट के समापन की घोषणा करता हूं। वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर का रोड मैप सुखद हो। सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास का मंत्र हम सभी के लिए एक पथ प्रदर्शक बन सकता है।
India did best to send across a message of unity and peace.
To serve unity and peace.
G20 is a G20 that is exceptionally very well organized.
The West.
The summit has given us a clear guiding star to follow.
आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा।
This is a big deal. This is a real big deal. And I want to thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. One Earth, one family, one future. That's the focus of this G20 summit.
We look forward to the integration of the initiative and the economic corridor project, which is announced in this meeting. I would like to thank those who worked with us to reach this founding step.
The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. This is nothing but historic.
All right, so first I want to go across and get you the 5 key takeaways from this G20 summit. The first and most important one is, of course, the consensus that was built around the joint statement. And like I said, there is some criticism that the language on the Russia-Ukraine war may have been watered down, but it was absolutely critical and essential for India to get a joint declaration. And for that joint declaration, and that's how the G20 operates, you needed consensus on the language. India was able to thrash out that consensus, of course, with some help from the United States and some of its G7 partners. India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Make absolutely no mistake about it. This is the most direct challenge in the last decade since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. The African Union getting a permanent membership of the G20, and that is hugely important because that picture of Mr. Modi hugging the African Union president and showing him the chair at the high table, that is a moment that has been equated with self-respect for an entire continent. An entire continent of 55 countries is getting a seat at the high table. China's isolation at international fora. Remember, Xi Jinping chose not to come for this meeting. And what this meeting showed is that with or without China, they are going to crack some pretty big deals. Also, the Modi government making this a people's presidency, and that of course was important because the G20 went to 60 different cities, it had 200 meetings, and finally culminated with the Delhi summit, which has been hailed as a success for these reasons that I just outlined. But I think the real watershed, as it were, was about China and this evolving dynamic that you're going to see increasingly. What you're going to see is competitive multilateralism. You're going to see forums like the G20, the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, which are West-run or West-controlled, are increasingly taking big-ticket decisions with or without China. Number one, China says that forums like the G20, and especially after Xi Jinping's decision to not come to Delhi, it was perceived that China sees the G20 as West-centric or West-oriented. The reality is the G20 represents 80% of the world's GDP. The biggest names were in that room at the Bharat Mandapam when these decisions were being made. Number two, and I think this is critical, China's stand on the G20 is that it has seen the G20, and increasingly so now, as more anti-China. There was a time when China was very gung-ho about the G20, not so much anymore. The reality is the failure to end border disputes. And mind you, this is not just border disputes with India. Yes, that's been going on for the better part of the last 3 years. There are massive territorial disputes with Japan, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with a whole host of Southeast Asian countries. Also, China's stand has been, if we could go to the next point on this, it is maintained, and this is significant on the Russia war, the Russia-Ukraine war, China's stand has been that it was NATO that provoked Russia into going into the Ukraine war. Fact is, and this is the reality that happened at the Delhi summit, India managed to get all parties to agree to the language. Russia was happy, the West was happy, and they got a joint declaration. The China stand now, and this is something you're going to see increasingly going forward, it will only engage and invest, certainly at the leadership level, at the level of the President, Xi Jinping, in fora such as the BRICS or the SCO, where it is the fulcrum, it is the driver of those fora. Whereas the reality is, things like the economic corridor that was announced over the weekend is a huge and perhaps a singularly biggest challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative. China's stand has been that BRICS and SCO can be seen potentially as counterweights to the G20 and other West-centric or West-dominated fora. Italy just announced, and Prime Minister Meloni just announced this as she was going into the bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi, that Italy will be leaving the Belt and Road Initiative, and reportedly she conveyed this to the Chinese Premier Li Qiang. Now, let me go across to our guests and try and get a sense. Now, no one is saying that a country like China, the second biggest economy in the world, can be isolated. But what happened in Delhi over the last 2 days shows that if China chooses not to take an active interest or active participation in any of these fora, then that is China's loss. Ambassador Ashok Kanta is a former Indian ambassador to China. Professor Brahma Chalani is strategic affairs expert. We have Andrew K.P. Liang, an independent China strategist. He's joining us from Hong Kong. We also have Terry Miliuski, who's the author of Blood for Blood, 50 years of the global warfare and the Global Khalistan Project, and Professor Max Abrams is a global security expert. Let me start with Ambassador Kanta, please. Ambassador Kanta, again, like I said, it's no one's case that China, as big as the second largest economy in the world, can be isolated. But certainly, are you getting the impression that what India and the West managed to do at the G20 over the last couple of days here in Delhi is make some really, really significant deals, not just the economic corridor, but also the language of the text that led to the joint declaration? It basically showed to China that if China does not want to make active participation in these fora, then that is China's loss. The world is going to move on and make some pretty important and big decisions with or without China.
Jacob, it's a fact that by not coming to New Delhi, unlike his participation at all previous G20 summits, Xi Jinping was conveying, among other things, that China attaches lower level of importance to G20 at present. It has lesser level of comfort with G20 compared to other platforms like BRICS. At the same time, while it's true that absence of Xi Jinping from New Delhi summit didn't negatively impact on outcomes of the summit, I will agree with you that this doesn't mean that China can be isolated or has been isolated. In fact, if you look at the outcomes, even on the critical paragraphs relating to Ukraine, to some way China and Russia had their way, because compared to Bali formulation, language was toned down quite a bit. This was in keeping with our own assessment that we need to move beyond Ukraine, look at central concerns of Global South. That should be the primary theme of this summit. And Western countries also realize that they don't want to lose Global South. They didn't want the summit hosted by India to fail. So they agreed to a formulation where there's no direct criticism of Russia, but at the same time all underlying principles have been retained. To that extent, China and Russia did manage to hold their own position. Likewise, on some other issues, for instance, restructuring of debt, there again, China didn't concede much ground. They held on to their position. On several other issues, for instance, USA being agreed upon as the host or president for 226, China had to go along with the consensus. So on the whole, it's a mixed bag for China. I expect China will continue to remain engaged with platforms like G20, IMF, World Bank, etc., even while it tries to give a boost to forums like BRICS and SCO, which are more dominated by China. But as things stand, there is no comparison between G20 as the premier forum for international cooperation and BRICS and SCO, both of which remain relatively limited organizations.
Regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, it is the West that agreed to the dilution, because without the dilution you wouldn't have got a joint statement. So in China's sort of worldview, it would have rather not had the joint statement and thereby deemed the Delhi G20 summit as not a success because a joint declaration did not come through. But I'm given to understand that it was President Biden who walked the extra mile and said, get it done. So it was the US and the Americans who managed to convince the rest of the G7 to agree to what was admittedly diluted language. It doesn't name Russia directly, and the Russians were happy. And the moment the Russians were happy, China had no choice but to go along.
You're asking whom?
Yeah, I'm asking you, Brahmacharani.
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize you were asking me. You're absolutely right. I agree with you. The West had as much a stake in the New Delhi summit success as India, because the very credibility of G20 was at stake. G20 is a largely Western-dominated organization, and the West therefore wanted to make a success of the New Delhi summit, which is why they went so far as to dilute the Bali language on the Ukraine war. What they got was a 37-page forward-looking consensus document that outlines the roadmap for a more sustainable and peaceful global future. It also, this document, this consensus document, also underscores India's burgeoning economic and geopolitical clout. In fact, the G20 summit was a high point in Indian diplomacy. And this high point comes at a time when China is grappling with multiple crises, from a dramatic economic downturn to growing domestic discontent. And as you rightly pointed out, Zaga, Xi Jinping's absence was China's loss. But a major autocracy like China facing international strong winds and growing domestic problems can be dangerous for the world. China today is facing a growing international pushback against its new imperial ambitions. China's economic growth has stalled, undercutting the CCP's justification for monopolizing power, that only the Communist Party can deliver rapid growth. Along with the dramatic economic downturn has come rising discontent in China. So it's against this background, Zaka, that Xi Jinping seems to be in a hurry to achieve what he calls the Chinese dream. So his appetite for risk has grown. We should note that, his appetite for risk has grown, and India has to be on its guard in case Xi Jinping is tempted to launch a military adventure to at least cut India down to size. In 1962, when Mao launched his war against India, his mission was to teach India a lesson. And Xi Jinping may be itching to teach India a lesson again.
So let me ask Andrew K.P. Liang, this whole competitive multilateralism that we're saying, clearly something has changed in the last year or so, because in the last G20 in Bali, which Xi Jinping attended, and he had a bilateral with Joe Biden, and that was seen as a bit of a reset moment for US-China ties. And certainly from the US's side, they've had, 3 or 4 secretaries. The Treasury Secretary was there. The Secretary of State was there some months ago. Just recently, just a few weeks ago, the Secretary of Commerce was there. But we haven't seen any reciprocal visits from China. What has changed in Xi Jinping's worldview that he is now looking, pretty much saying that, look, I don't have any faith, or I'm not that interested in forums like the G20 or the World Bank or the IMF, which is West-driven and West-led. I'm going to invest my time and energy and resources in things like the Asian Infrastructure Bank, your SCO and BRICS. But the reality is, Mr. Liang, that the G20 is the premier global forum in the world to address the biggest problems of the world. SCO or BRICS are not going to be a match to that.
Well, I don't think that China would forsake the G20 forever. I mean, this is an over-exaggeration. I mean, this is one meeting. Don't forget, as you said, President Xi turned up in all the meetings, and recently in the BRICS meeting chaired by India. So I think that this single absence does not mean that China is forsaking the G20. By no means, because China embraces globalization. Now, you rightly highlighted the point on what has changed, accounting for President Xi's absence. What has changed, of course, is a very toxic kind of atmosphere, not between China and India, although the relationship could have been much improved, but between the United States and China. And you could see that even recently, various American senior officials were trying to meet the Chinese counterparts, especially on the military side. It's only very, very recently that China agreed to do so, because there is a great deal of double talk and double standards as far as the US is concerned. But as far as the Global South is concerned, China is a great supporter, a staunch supporter of the Global South. Now, as for the, you highlighted the significant signature, India, Middle East, and Europe, this link, sea and rail link, as if this is going to change everything. No, because China remains the largest trading partner to 128 countries around the world, compared with only 58 for the United States, let alone India. In order to make use of this single link, you've got to trade, and to such a huge extent as to displace China's embeddedness in the global and supply and value chain.
No, but one second. I think there is I want to underline a word of caution there, and I want to get in Max Abrams into this conversation. China, of course, has huge tons of money, no doubt about it. Many of these infrastructure projects are funded by China as part of BRI. There's a lot of debt funding involved there. But surely it's no one's case, not even the Chinese's case, that singularly China will be able to take on the might of India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, France, Germany, Italy, and the United States. And of course, this is going to be financially backed by the IMF and the World Bank, and also by private equity firms. We had a senior minister in government yesterday on the show saying that private equity firms and sovereign wealth funds have expressed great interest in financing this project. Surely, wouldn't the signal, and I'm curious to know, in countries like Namibia, for example, or Ethiopia, or Sri Lanka, which has seen the brunt of Chinese debt trap, what sort of signal does this project send?
Directed to me.
Yeah, that's to you, Max Abrams, yeah.
I mean, this is part of a continuous geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. And it almost seems like China got a head start with the Belt and Road Initiative. The United States now is focusing substantially on creating some kind of a return alternative, calling upon its old friends, its old sort of institutions, investing more in it. And there's a race, it almost seems like, between the US and China over the global South. And there's a financial element, there's a military element. I think that the truth is somewhere in between this conversation. I do think that we should, China is an absolute powerhouse in terms of its economic size, in terms of how industrious it is, its population. The fact that there was one sort of missed meeting, I think, shouldn't be overstated. But I do think that it is important that, especially the United States, look at Xi's absence as sort of an opportunity to exploit. And Biden went in there and actually seems to have come out of this summit with an actual concrete achievement. So this meeting wasn't purely symbolic. It was actually important in pragmatic terms. But this is a multiple iteration game. Who knows? In the next G20, I would expect Xi to be present. There are all sorts of theories as to why he wasn't there, mostly because of the particular bilateral strain between China and India.
Yeah.
But make no mistake, China is an international player and will continue to try to build up its trade all over the world, particularly in the global South.
Okay, I like I said, and I want to go across to that wall. What I said was at the start of the show as well, I don't think it's anyone's case that the world's second biggest economy can be isolated. But clearly what we're going to see going forward, and Terry Miliuski, please weigh in on this, is I think you're going to see competitive multilateralism. You're going to see China backing those forums that it feels it is the center of all attention and leadership. And you're going to see the West and countries like India pushing those forums which have a West-centric or a West-oriented and the rest of the world-oriented kind of motive. Even on the AU membership, right? The African Union now being a member of the G20. One of the Chinese journalists told me this, which I thought was quite pertinent, that the image of the Prime Minister hugging the AU chairman and then leading him to take his seat at the high table. China may have invested tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure projects in Africa, but that image of that self-respect, the AU finally, getting its rightful place, its rightful seat at that high table, no amount of billions of dollars can buy that. And that will be relayed across the African continent. Mr. Miliuski.
Can I suggest that the ascendancy of China, we now know is going to be challenged. We are seeing a gathering of the teams, if you will, of what is going to unfold perhaps over the next 30 or even 50 years, the next superpower contest. And we're seeing one step in the gathering of the teams. Where is India going to stand? Well, we are seeing, are we not, in this diluted joint statement on Ukraine, there's a message in that, isn't there? That the Western team is not exactly united. You can paper over the cracks with nice-sounding statements, and you can applaud the victory of India, if you will. That the important thing is we got a joint statement. No, the important thing is, what does it say? And what it says is practically nothing. It is a big step back from the Bali statement, as all of your guests have pointed out. Russia basically gets a free ride in this statement, and not that that's going to change anything. The West will go its own way. Mr. Biden, Mr. Macron, and Mr. Trudeau will all continue with their attitude towards Russia and the war in Ukraine, and they will completely ignore this wonderful diluted joint statement that was achieved in Delhi.
You're in a sense reiterating my point.
It's not going to change the reality.
You're actually validating my point. My point is exactly that the West realized, and in particular, I'm given to understand this happened over a conversation between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden the day before the G20 began, and it was Biden who realized that there's more in diluting language and thereby getting India a win, making sure that a joint communiqué happens, rather than insisting on language and ensuring that the Delhi G20 is deemed as a failure.
Yeah, and who's going to notice when the West completely ignores the joint statement and proceeds to go on insisting on a victory for Ukraine over Russian aggression? You're right. I don't disagree with your point. But I'm just pointing out that we've had a G20 years ago. I guess it was 2010 in Toronto. Nobody remembers these statements, and we congratulated ourselves, as I recall, upon achieving joint statements, even though they were diluted. You see, Canada did a great job. And of course, India is going through the same stage now. Yeah, we did a great job getting a joint statement which says nothing. How it unfolds remains to be seen, and I don't think that statement is going to make any difference to anything.
Since you mentioned Toronto, and since you mentioned Canada, and since you're joining us from Toronto, Prime Minister Trudeau seems to be having a bit of a tough time here, including, of course, his flight is still not taken off because I believe there is a technical snag. A second flight is on its way, and the earliest he'll be able to leave India is Tuesday morning or Tuesday afternoon. But let me ask, Professor Brahmachalani, and then after that to Ambassador Ashokant this. The idea, and Trudeau was asked a question about this, there was a very strongly worded statement from the Prime Minister's office about this whole business of Khalistan elements and supporting of Khalistan elements. But at the press conference, Professor Chalani, Trudeau made this out to be a freedom of expression issue. How can it be a freedom of expression issue when one side is actively calling for the secession from the Indian state? That's not a freedom of expression issue.
You're absolutely right. It's the fact that elements based in Canada are openly inciting violence against Indian diplomatic assets, against Indian diplomats. They're calling for violence. So this is about security, international security. How would Canada react if India allowed Canadian secessionists to threaten its diplomats based in New Delhi or other places in India? But this has been happening repeatedly in Canada. And also, Indians have been attacked, their places of worship have been attacked in Canada, and this has been going on for so long. The fact is that Canada has become a hub of radical Sikh extremists. There are actually terrorists engaged in drug trafficking and other crimes, and that the Trudeau government, because of its coalition compulsions. It is in alliance with the Radical Six to stay in office, and therefore it turns a blind eye to their activities. This is the unfortunate
reality. So is it coalition compulsions alone, Ambassador Kant? Because, we saw such attacks, not just in Canada, we saw it in Australia, we saw it in the UK, most famously outside the Indian High Commission. But those governments, A, have acted and be seen to be acting against these elements. And more importantly, you don't hear the Prime Minister of Britain or the Prime Minister of Australia saying that this is a freedom of expression issue.
No, Canada is in a different category. In a way, they have been a serial offender on this issue. There is a recurring pattern of behavior which is very objectionable our point of view. That's why Prime Minister raised it so strongly with Prime Minister Trudeau, and also we put out a statement conveying our unhappiness with the Canadian position. But Jacka, if you permit, I would like to just comment on a couple of the issues which came up earlier. We need to understand why US-led West decided to go along with a formulation which is relatively moderate compared to Bali template. To my mind, there are three important considerations there. One, of course, people have talked about, India hosting it. They didn't want India to, summit hosted by India to be less than successful. But there are a couple of other very important considerations. One, Global South, that India, sort of projected Global South as the central theme of this summit. It's G20 presidency. West is getting this idea that they're losing Global South. They need to take on board concerns and aspirations of Global South. They can't focus exclusively on issues like Ukraine. That explains why they're willing to, dilute the position. Thirdly, if there had been no, joint declaration coming out of New Delhi summit, this would have to some extent weakened the position of G20. And G20 is a very important platform, not only for Western countries, but for others as well. This is the premier international forum for economic cooperation. So all these considerations persuaded Western countries to, go along with a relatively, diluted formulation. And China also didn't want to antagonize Global South. So there was, I think India played its cards very well, took help of Indonesia, Brazil and South Africa, the previous chair and two incoming presidents of G20. And together, these emerging countries, as Dr. Jaishankar put it, played a very influential role in shaping the outcome of G20
let me ask
summit.
Andrew Liang that as well, because these are again countries that China has been trying to cultivate. In fact, China proposed and managed to get the expansion of the BRICS. It now includes some of the countries of the Global South. But the way in which Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, India sort of took the lead to make sure that A, the language on this is acceptable to everyone, and two, I think you must have also seen that picture of the United States President along with the leaders of Brazil, India and South Africa, along with the World Bank President also in that picture, which is clearly giving out the message that while these countries, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, etc., are the voice of the Global South, the US also wants to be seen as their partner. They don't want to lose the Global South to China. So today, whether you like it or not, Mr. Liang, by not coming to the G20, in a sense, Xi Jinping has also vacated, or I wouldn't say vacated that space, but certainly ceded some of that space to other countries.
Well, to a certain extent, of course, the absence itself sort of decreases the diplomatic space for China in that important forum. But don't forget that President Xi was represented by his Prime Minister, and who is his closest confidant, and of course is one of the top leaders in China. But as far as the language is concerned, as pointed out, the language is watered down to such an extent that it's really non-controversial. It's impossible for countries like Russia to object to not wanting a war, of not respecting other people's sovereignty, of not seeking a means to end this never-ending war. So I think the language is important, and that's what diplomacy is all about. I mean, just imagine that if we were a much stronger language, sort of condemning Russia and also dragging China into it, do you think that even if President Xi wasn't there, do you think that China would have agreed? Do you think the Russian would have agreed? No. But this is a triumph of India's diplomacy, at a crafting level, as far as Ukraine is concerned. Okay. Now, as for the rest of the agenda, of course, there is a great deal of common ground. And even this signature link between India, Middle East, and Europe, China, in a way, welcomes it. Because at the end of the day, whether it's a sea link or a railway link, it depends on trade. And China is the greatest trader. So China is not excluded, from using this link.
Again, I want to go back to the interaction I had with one of the ministers of the government of India, asking him details about this project, this economic corridor project. And he said today it's envisaged as a rail and land corridor project, but tomorrow it could be a gas pipeline. It could also be fiber optic cables. It could be a data corridor as opposed to a land corridor. So anything is possible, because once you get right of way, then it's up to the countries concerned to decide what else they want to use this corridor for. But let me go to Max Abrams. And I know the US is hosting the APEC in November. Again, it's a forum that can be seen as US-led or West-led. There's a lot going on behind the scenes right now to try and convince Xi Jinping to attend that. But if this is the hypothesis that Xi personally is not going to be invested in those fora where he sees China as not the center of the room or the center of the table, as it were, but he's going to be invested in forums like the BRICS and SCO, then again, what hope do you have of APEC? Or would that then necessarily mean that the Biden administration has to make significant concessions in the hope that they can get him to attend APEC?
These are interesting questions. I mean, more fundamentally, we're talking about, how important are international institutions? You compare that, there are different sort of theories within international relations. Liberalism would emphasize the importance of these kinds of institutions. That's certainly one way of understanding the influence of a country, is what is its role in these institutions. One of the ways the United States has been able to exercise influence since World War II is by standing up these financial institutions and simultaneously dominating them. But there's another sort of theoretical framework, which is liberalism, which really doesn't put much emphasis on these international institutions at all. It would be more likely to look at sort of the strength of the international system in terms of the size of its economy, its population, its trajectory, and then look at bilateral ties. What are the relations between China and all sorts of countries around the world? When you look at the BRI from that perspective, it seems stronger. 155 countries around the world are participants in it, and that's true whether or not the leader of China shows up.
Okay.
So I mean, I think more fundamentally, what we're looking at is this question of how much do these institutions have an independent effect on relations between China and the rest of the countries around the world.
All right. I got to give Terry Miliuski the final word, and I want to come back to the Canada question because, again, you're joining us from Toronto. Please explain this to us. I mean, why are we not seeing the leaders? I mean, there are these protests that have happened in England, it's happened in Australia, it's happened in other parts, even in the United States. You don't see Biden or Sunak or Albanese call this a freedom of expression issue. Clearly, there is something going on there in Canada to the extent, Mr. Miliuski, that even substantive issues like the FTA is pretty much now in the cold storage.
Yes, it's in cold storage precisely because on the bilateral scene, we see here at this G20 summit, you see a stark difference between the wishy-washy, toothless, vague, diluted mass statement by everyone in which probably has very little impact, and the bilateral, very focused punch in the nose which Modi delivered to Prime Minister Trudeau over these bilateral irritants, which you rightly bring up, because that is going to make a difference in a way that a diluted mass statement will not. That's going to make a difference because it's the toughest statement we've ever seen from an Indian leader directly to a Canadian leader, that we are not going to take this anymore, painting targets on the backs of Indian diplomats by calling them killers and parading through the streets with a celebration of the assassination of Indira Gandhi. This is the kind of thing that we have seen very recently getting worse and worse in Canada. And now Prime Minister Modi is saying to the Canadians, enough. You got to do something about this.
Help me also understand.
Trudeau has been hiding behind this.
Yeah, Mr.
Go ahead.
Please help me also understand, because I believe the opposition leader there, Pierre Poilievre, I think his name is, who could likely challenge Trudeau and the current establishment in the next election, has made this an issue. He's made this an issue and tweeted about it. I think the papers are carrying it, that Trudeau's got his foreign policy wrong. His India policy is certainly wrong. Is it going to have a domestic cost?
Yes, so far we haven't heard from any party leader, including Mr. Poilievre, who stands to become the next prime minister, according to the polls, if an election were held today or soon. We have not seen him yet specifically denouncing the Canadian policy of, let them have their parades, let them have their martyr posters of mass murdering assassins, and let's not make a fuss about it. We haven't heard him directly attack that. He has merely said, so far as I know, that he disagrees with Trudeau's failure to advance Canada-India relations.
All right.
But I'm saying to you that I believe as a result of what Modi did at this summit, this punch in the nose that he administered, that we're not going to put up with it anymore, I think he's given Mr. Poilievre a thought, maybe if I take a different approach and I directly attack Canada's supine acceptance of these this terrorist worship by Khalistanis in Canada, maybe that's going to help me at the polls come election time.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to all our guests. Fascinating conversation, and what a fascinating summit this was, the Delhi-hosted G20 summit. Like I said, it will go down definitely as a success, no doubt about it. It's ticked off all the boxes, whether it's the joint statement, this massive infrastructure project, rivaling the BRI, giving the African Union pride of place. All the boxes that needed to be ticked have been ticked. Certainly, it'll go down in history as one of the most successful G20s, perhaps even signaling a change of direction in great power relations between the United States and China, and India, of course, playing a part in that as well.